first let me kick off though on this, the theme, I guess, of abundance for this whole conference. And of course, we live in an age of media abundance as well. There's some great things about that. There's also some problems that result from that. One of the great things about it is that literally everybody in the world, or almost everybody in the world now, has access to an unparalleled amount of news and information. That's revolutionary. But that's also one of the bad things about it, is that the abundance itself creates its own problems. And I think the key problem is, how do we separate the wheat from the chaff, the signal from the noise? How do we find good, reliable, verified news and information, and more importantly, that sort of information that can then lead us to make informed decisions and choices, and potentially lead us to informed action. So that's actually the definition of what news literacy is finding reliable, verified news and information, and on which we can make informed choices. And those can be everything from consumer choices, like how can I decide what's the best new smartphone to buy, and knowing that the review that you've read actually was an ad paid for by Samsung saying that Samsung is the one you should buy, all the way to things that have profound implications for democracy, like, you know, who should be the next president, and is he in fact a Muslim who was born somewhere else who's plotting to overthrow democracy or not. So it's important in a lot of different contexts, but ultimately it's very important for media and democracy, which is really what we're all about. So that's the setting. I'm now at Stony Brook University at the Center for News Literacy, which is one of the big players in the academic space on this. There are many others. And Stony Brook is about to complete, with the assistance of a big Knight grant initially, the education of 10,000 non-journalism students in news literacy over the past few years. One of the other big funders in this space, however, is the McCormick Foundation. So that leads me to, I'm going to give you a quick little introduction to the panelists, and there's more information available if you want to know it. So first up is going to be Jennifer Choi. To my left, Jennifer is a program officer at the McCormick Foundation. They're not only sponsoring the Media Consortium conference, but they also are a big player in the news literacy space. Jennifer joined the foundation in 2012, and she guides the grant making in community-based news literacy. And she's going to be telling us more not only about what McCormick has done in this space, but also why she thinks that it's, as I do, that it's important to get it out of the academic context and get it into the media context, and how that actually can be really beneficial for your business and the survival of your organization. And thank you very much, Jennifer, for coming here today. After Jennifer, we're going to go to Josh Stearns, as you know probably, the Press Freedom Campaign Director at Free Press. Free Press, obviously a big player in the media reform movement, and Josh helps run national advocacy campaigns, and has also done quite a bit in the realm of news literacy and verification in particular. And again, he'll go into a lot more detail, and there is more available if you want to learn about these people, but I want to get to the event pretty quick. Following Josh, we're going to go to Diane Ruiz. As you heard, if you were just in the session, she's the co-founder and also producer and reporter of a nonprofit media organization, Media Consortium member, obviously, People Power Media. And they create media that amplifies the voices from communities, largely marginalized communities, in terms of going to the communities, asking them about the news that affects them, asking them if it's being covered by other media organizations, which all too often it isn't, and then going out and covering that. And they're also involved in working with the community and training them in how to do their own media and doing news literacy training. She'll tell you more about that. And then finally, of course, you all know Linda Julinda, who's one of the key members of the Media Consortium, also the editor and executive director of the G.W. Williams Center for Independent Journalism. And they work not only nationally, but on a more local or regional basis, encouraging reporting projects for journalists of color, women, and young people, and pursuing both public interest and investigative reporting. So that's basically the setup, and with that, I'd like to turn first to Jennifer and have her tell us a little bit about the background of the McCormick Foundation in this space, and why she thinks that it's really important for media organizations to get involved in news literacy.
Thanks, Rory. So I want to first and foremost applaud all of you for coming to a panel about news literacy, because it's not the sexiest topic ever. But the McCormick Foundation, we give $5.5 million every year in grants to really enhance the health of the journalism sector. Increasingly, we've become a lot more place-based, meaning we are focusing on Chicago investments, mostly because compared to most other journalism funders in the country, like Ignite, we don't have quite as much to give. So we're trying to be strategic about how to move the needle in a sector that has so many needs. We are we're experimenting in a lot of ways, and Why News Matters, which is our signature program right now around news literacy, is one of those initiatives. Before that, and let me contextualize kind of why we're investing in news literacy. We funded a lot in youth journalism, especially in Chicago. We've built a community-wide network. I think that nationally we've become, that's kind of been our brand as far as building a youth journalism ecosystem here in Chicago. We've also done a lot of training professional journalists. You might be familiar with our Poynter Specialized Reporting Institutes program. So in terms of, again, a sector that has so much need and a sector that is constantly challenged by capacity issues, we think professional journalism training is a key need that we've been able to kind of put our stamp on. So with so from youth journalism and training, especially with scholastic journalism and press freedoms, First Amendment rights, etc., we thought, okay, we're going to invest in news literacy because we need to look at audience. So if we're going to start with young people and get young people engaged in journalism, how do we ramp up these skills on how to be critically literate and how to vet this information so that young people can feel empowered to make decisions with regard to making not only their own lives better, but their communities better. So in 2009, we had our initial investments with Stony Brook and News Literacy Project. And these are one of many players, but kind of the major players in the news literacy movement, and the news literacy movement is pretty young. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about why that's been challenging to us. So then so we kind of, dabbled in this space, and basically in 2011, the board tasked us to say, all right, you're kind of all over the place, your investments are all over the place, journalism has so much need, let's narrow down. Where can we actually really start to try to invest in a space that maybe other foundations, quite frankly, have had ADD in? So news literacy was the thing, because we're like, all right, we've been focusing on content. Journalism funders typically go, for content. Why not focus on audience? And quite frankly, I thought, that makes sense because so many news organizations, they think, all right, let's push content or let's push sales and blah, blah, blah. They don't have any knowledge of their audiences, right? So we're like, all right, let's go back, let's think about audience, and let's say, all right, communities, news is important. Why does news matter? How can we get you to consume the news better? So then in 2013, we launched a 3-year initiative called Why News Matters, $6 million. So we're trying to aim for $2 million a year, and it's a little messy. But anyways, so we started 2013, 2014, 2015 obviously is going to be the culmination of our initiative. And I just want to kind of go into the lessons learned right away, because I think that might be the most relevant and beneficial for this audience. So basically, in 2013, we're like, okay, we're going to focus on Chicago. There are about 28 to 30 grantees. They were all over the place. I mean, first of all, we took for granted, A, what news meant to different audiences in different communities, in different age groups, and what news literacy would even mean to different communities. So even as a program, as a journalism program, we took for granted the definition of news and what news literacy would mean to different people, especially young people. So not only did we learn more about how that definition has changed, but we also learned that the relationship between audience, journalists, and even public officials and folks that are decision makers in our communities, all those relationships were rapidly changing, obviously because of the changing technology. And we kind of also took for granted that audiences were really stupid, because quite frankly, with social media, and we see this in the Boston bombing case, even young people and young people from underserved or underrepresented communities, they're becoming savvier, actually. They're actually questioning, how content is trickled down, et cetera. And, we are seeing that a lot more people are committing acts of journalism, and that, people are, that groups of families and friends are actually becoming editors and distributors of content. So so when we were going to our grantees and saying, okay, ramp up these skills for your young people in your communities and teach them these skills, a lot of these young people came back to us and said, well, why should we get trained on these skills? Because actually I'm a savvy consumer, I don't believe everything necessarily. And quite frankly, when I watch the news broadcast, and they, cover a youth violence issue in my community, they get the facts wrong. So basically, we've seen, and I'm going to kind of plug a panel later on that my colleague Mark Hallett is going to be on, and Carrie Liderson of the Social Justice Initiative. We also realize that the other part of this is the content side. How do we get journalists to go back to these core values of strengthening their credibility with the community and build that trust, given that these vehicles are changing the way people, meaning consumers and audiences, are taking in the news. So there is a business case, and there's a community relevant business case, especially I think for content producers and providers. And what we're trying to do is really also engage journalists to say, look, show your work, be confident that you're professional journalists, and people know that you're professional journalists, and that you can facilitate a dialogue around really difficult issues. Journalists can actually get access and the attention from these public sector stakeholders and decision makers. But you also know how to build trust and build relationships with community members. We can't just assume that we are caught in our ivory towers and that we will tell a story a certain way without really knowing the audience or really building that relationship with our audiences that we just are taking for granted. So that's
You've opened a lot of cans of worms here.
Good.
So that's essentially, and what we're also learning is that there's an issue of representation. So a lot of the content producers in our Why News Matters initiative are telling us there's an issue of inclusion and representation that needs to be improved in the news literacy kind of movement.
Great, okay, well, so we've opened the can of worms, and Jennifer has, so Let's go to Josh to stir those worms up a little bit.
All right, I'll try not to step on too many worms. So at Free Press, we think about news literacy as part of media advocacy. We sort of talk about three legs to making change in the media: media literacy, media creation, and media policy. And they all work really intimately together. So we focus a lot on public education to help people understand the structural and political issues that shape the news, how news is made, and why news matters, so that they can advocate for laws and policies that support more independent, diverse, democratic media. And I often return to a quote from Dan Gilmore, whose book Media Active, I think, is a really seminal piece around new ideas around news and media literacy. And he says, in a participatory culture, none of us is fully literate unless we are both creating and consuming. And so I would add to that that increasingly people are engaging with media, are creating media as part of the way they participate in politics and civic life. So media consumption and media creation are linked, but civic engagement and media engagement are also linked. So I think it's worth starting and building on what Jennifer was talking about why news literacy matters concretely to us as newsrooms and news organizations. And I'm really looking at this outside the context of what Rory was talking about is outside the educational context, but news literacy as something, somebody in the last panel actually said building news relationships, which I loved. And so how can news be a mode of community engagement that's around building news relationships, which is different, I think, from just straight consumer or subscriber relationships. So for one thing, I've got sort of 4 points here. There's an opportunity here to bridge the disconnect between our communities and our newsrooms. And by communities, I don't just mean geographical communities, but communities of interest, communities of expertise, all the ways that communities can be formed, and break down those walls. So while more and more people are participating in media making as creators, collaborators, distributors, consumers, I think the democratization of the tools of journalism has also hidden or obscured the labor that it takes to do journalism sometimes, or the kind of journalism that many of you do in your organizations. So news literacy is an opportunity to be more transparent and open with our communities about the work, the risks, the care, the principles, the time, the energy, the money it takes to do meaningful journalism. And it creates a chance for us to discuss and debate what the impact of that journalism is so that the community can speak back to us about the fact that we're not representing their community well, or that we are missing a key part of the story. And that they can understand maybe why we missed that, because we have a conversation with them about how news is actually done. So I think news literacy is also an opportunity to teach and serve our communities in new ways and collaborate with them. In general, my experience is that people want to be trustworthy participants of journalism. I know that may be hard. We were talking about comment sections in news earlier, and sometimes we might look at our comment sections on our sites and cringe. But I actually have found when I've been traveling around, especially after the Boston bombing, I was traveling around doing a lot of talks about verification of social media content, and a lot of people came up to me, citizen journalists, community media makers, and just average Joes who was saying, I want to better understand how I can assess tweets and images so I don't get duped and so I don't share bad images. They feel a responsibility to their networks, the people on their Facebook feeds, to be sharing good content that's trustworthy. And so we as journalists are grappling with this too, and as we're creating tools, we can also be training and working with our communities to share those tools and build those expertise. So what that's going to do for us as we're looking out to the community for user-generated content, for photos coming in from breaking news events, from all sorts of things, we're helping them be more trustworthy media creators as well, and that's going to make our content stronger as we collaborate with them. So Clay Shirky at an event I was at recently said, the abundance of news and information is cultivating more sophisticated audiences, and who wants to not just understand the news, but also the process behind the news. I think that's really accurate. So the third point I want to make is that news literacy is an opportunity for us to build trust. And the first 2 points that I said, I think, build on this. But for me, one of the promises of a sort of participatory news literacy is the potential to build more trusting, reciprocal relationships with our communities, our readers, and our audience, where we can actually discuss our ethics and goals and mission with them. I don't know if you've seen in the last 24 hours, there's been a big debate about Piero Migliar's funding of groups in the Ukraine and his funding of journalism at the Glenn Greenwald's The Intercept Project. And Glenn has just responded, and he, at the end of his post, he listed a set of principles that sort of guides him. And Jeff Jarvis has now challenged him to set forth, and he challenged really all news organizations to set forth a set of principles that are something much different than SPJ Code of Ethics, but are like your principles, your commitments to your community, and that can be a point of dialogue within your community. And so finally, the last piece, news literacy, I think, is an opportunity for us to build value. It's an opportunity for news organizations to see us in a new way, to value us more deeply. And I relate this to my experience of joining a community-supported agriculture farm. Are those of you familiar with CSAs? So when I joined my CSA, I didn't know that much about farms. But every week, I got newsletters from the farmers in emails saying, here's what's going on the farm this week, here's how the weather's impacting the work that we're doing, here's the big crop loss we just had, here's why it happened. By the way, we need help, can you come out and help us? By the way, we need actually more donations. I know you already paid for the year, but we could really use a couple extra bucks. And I began to see the process of farming firsthand and really understood the value and work that they put into it. If we can bring that kind of transparency and conversation and openness to the work that we do in and with our communities, I think there's a really opportunity there to build the value of those relationships. So for me, I see this as a mix. I was going to draw a Venn diagram, so you have to get the virtual Venn diagram going here. But between transparency, accountability, engagement, and participation. So transparency, to Jennifer's point, show your work. Accountability, provide avenues for meaningful feedback, corrections, and dialogue. Engagement, engage with the communities around the news before, during, and after. So it's not just like drop a story and then tweet about it and respond to the comments. There's a wide range of ways that we can do engagement. And then participation, so collaborate as co-creators in the news with your communities. And to me, those four things are sort of the blueprint for a more participatory news literacy that's rooted in our newsrooms and our communities, and that I think can help us build more sustainable relationships between communities and newsrooms. So for me, I'm interested in news literacy for the community, but I think that has to be paired with community literacy for newsrooms. We actually have to build up a fluency on both sides so that our communities understand how to access the newsrooms and how to talk to journalists and how to make their voices heard and assess news content across the wide variety of sources. But we also need newsrooms to be able to genuinely go into communities and meet people where they are and to go in with openness. I'm really excited to hear about the work that you guys are doing in that spot. So I'll leave it there.
Well, great points, and I agree, we need to move beyond just the democratization of the means of production and distribution. We need to democratize the values of journalism, and that's what this is about. So, talk about reaching out to the community. Diane is going to tell you about the very community-based grassroots work that she and her partner and others are doing in the Bay Area. So, please.
Okay, so People Power Media's mission is to amplify voices from marginalized communities to empower them to impact public policy. So how do we do that? We go out to communities and ask them what their priorities are for the year, what issues they feel are the most pressing for their community, and then ask them what campaigns are they working on, when is that happening, and how can we create a story that would change the conversation about that particular issue. So in the Bay Area, especially in San Francisco and Oakland, affordability is a big issue this year. So we're going to do a lot of reporting on many facets of that, especially affordability of housing. So we take this beat reporting approach, which is not, something new, obviously, but it's something definitely on the decline because of the amount of time and money that takes to do that. And many, as you know, mainstream organizations don't see the same investment on their dollar for, production of amount of stories. So we address news literacy in two main ways. So in the way that we produce our journalism as well as training within the community. So we see basically the fact, like many of the previous speakers were saying, that citizen journalism is, or the rise of citizen journalism is a symptom of people not seeing themselves in the news and them wanting to produce news that addresses their issues and concerns and perspectives. So we basically try and be a reliable source for news on community-based movements to impact public policy. The issues that we focus on are immigration, housing, and poverty. And we saw the need because we know, so for instance, from Joseph's especially community organizing background, we know that nonprofits who try and impact public policy, they have definitely, they have strengths and they have weaknesses. So one of their strengths is actually knowing who to talk to in City Hall, getting people to rally around an issue and show up and talk about it at City Hall, as well as showing up for a protest and letting people know that this is an issue. They may not have media training though. They may not know how to communicate their issues in a way that many of their opponents know how to do. And those are big hospitals, corporations, real estate developers, things like that. They can hire lobbyists to propagate a meme, or they don't have the same tools and resources. And frankly, they also see it as, even though if they have the training and knowledge, which of course many of them do, they just don't know, they have more pressing issues. So there's, somebody that needs a home tonight may not be, they may not go out and talk to that reporter.
That's the working journalist, so that needs the home too.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, that's
Full
what we're
circle.
converging.
Yeah. So we see that need, and we say, okay, we're going to prioritize the issues that are most important to you, and we're also going to time it with an action that you're planning, major legislative point, but we're also going to do it from the same principles of journalism that are, what we stand for, what we all stand for. We're going to talk to the other side. We're going to not, just create it as a propaganda tool for the media organization. Frankly, the nonprofits don't want that because they want to be seen as, here's someone else other than us telling our story and saying that it's important. Let's see. So one kind of early example of a successful way that we did that. So we created a documentary, short feature, about 15 minutes. So our videos run between 5 and 15 minutes. Waiting for affordable housing in Toronto. This is actually, we've done stories between Toronto, Canada, and the Bay Area. And so there was a huge waiting list for affordable housing. Over 150,000 people were waiting for affordable housing, actually as many that were in public housing in Toronto. And at the same time, our crazy crack-smoking mayor, yes, Rob Ford, who didn't admit it at the time yet, but he was also doing other things that were very bad, including wanting to sell public housing. Because he needed, the city needed the money and thought they could fund repairs by selling existing stock. So the people that were living in those houses were like, well, what are we gonna do about it? And it's a stupid business model to try and float that way. And so the community group, we created a documentary, separate from the group actually in this instance, saying, well, there's a huge need for affordable housing. Let's interview people who are waiting for affordable housing, and showing that selling off public housing is a big problem. So the group actually approached us when they saw the work that we did, and they played it to City Council Executive Committee hearing. Logistically, we did that by pairing up our speaking times. So we've got 4 people together to relinquish their time to play the 8-minute, we reduced it to 8-minute video. And it was amazing because there were actually council members that were referring to the video in their deliberations. They eventually, and of course we're not going to take all the credit, it was the community that was pushing for months to get this done, but they did eventually vote to save 90% of the homes. And there were people who were staunch conservatives, you know, saying this is a problem, you know, coupled with what was happening, people that were talking at the hearing in the community. So the second part, again, what we do is news literacy programs. So one example that's coming up is there's a movement with youth in San Francisco that came out of, it's called Stand Up for SF, and it came out of basically the day that Bad Kid was getting all the publicity with you know, San Francisco police being known internationally for supporting Make-A-Wish Foundation.
Does everybody know the Bad Kid story? Okay.
Yeah, they basically made his wish come true to be a real life bad kid. So they pretended like San Francisco was Gotham City and the police commissioner would, you know, have them arrest Joker and stuff like that, right?
And the entire city sort of shut down
Yeah.
almost for a
It
day
was a
around Bad
parade.
Kid.
Yeah. So,
You had to be there.
yeah, it got a lot of attention, but on the other side of town, in the Mission District, there's a public housing complex called Valencia Gardens, and the very same day that Bad Kid was going on, they were police were basically beating up young black men on the first instance for riding his bike on the sidewalk. So there's a tale of two San Franciscos right there on that day. You started to organize and say, you know what, we actually did quite a bit of organizing years before on community engagement with the youth, with police and youth. And here's actually a list that they're supposed to be engaging around mutual respect. So why isn't this going on? What can we do to get them to re-engage in that issue? So they created Stand Up for SF, and part of it is it's happening on April 5th. And we're gonna do a news literacy panel for the youth that are participating on that day. And our plan is basically, because it's a short amount of time, to look at, we ask the youth, how are they accessing news? You know, what apps are they using? Are they getting it all through Facebook? And sharing that amongst themselves. And then asking them, you know, how do you consume news? Like, do you take it for granted that it's true? Is it, you know, do you only know something because many of your friends are sharing it, or do you actually seek out news agencies to you know, verify if it's true or to get your news? And then we're going to have a follow-up exercise on how to talk to the media if they are in that position. And we've done trainings on that as well. So we've done trainings with New Harris You Need Us, which is a nonprofit in San Francisco, and they do mostly policy-based advocacy on issues affecting Latino women. And so what we did for that training is we gave them kind of an advanced copy of what the training would be like. And that talked about basically what news is, and the way that news works, the time pressure that journalists face, all of this stuff that would impact why news turns out the way that it does. And then give them tips about ways to give statements to different types of reporters, so print versus video versus radio. And then we actually got them to practice them on film and gave like live critique. So after the in-person lesson, they already prepared statements, and then we filmed them and then critiqued their statements and gave them back to them. And the other type of training we do is visual storytelling. So actually two nonprofits, having them know how to tell their stories visually, the importance of it for fundraising, for instance, for newsletters, and then kind of logistical things like saving it, making sure there's somebody there to take photos. So kind of a multi-pronged approach to news literacy. And of course, many of the things that Josh was saying, that you really need to get out into the community and ask them what's going on with them, as well as preparing them to tell their stories themselves. themselves. And we're also expanding our website so that there could be more engagement once that initial video is published.
Great, well, thank you, Diane. Some great examples from the grassroots. And I think, clearly you can see from what Diane was saying, the value of news literacy, the value that the media organization can bring to the community. But the other piece of that, as Josh was referring to, is the value that engaging with the community can bring back to your organization. Everybody's talking about sustainability in the media, and we all need to have multiple revenue streams, membership models, conferences, whatever. Well, if you don't have an actual engagement with an audience, with the community, none of that is going to be possible no matter how much work you put in it. But if you do have a trust relationship that you've developed with the community, I think all of that and more is possible. So to bring us on home, reclose the can, I don't know. Linda is going to wrap things up, and then we're going to open it up to the audience as well, please.
Okay. Yes, I have the big job of doing a roundup here. So there are a couple of points that you actually already mentioned, and I think the one that stuck out for me was the phrase community literacy for newsrooms. I've been searching for a term, something like that, for years. I've worked both in mainstream media and in alternative and independent media over the last 25, 30 years. I actually got my start in alternative media and then moved into more corporate media. And during that time, I have seen all the different transitions of how we define news, how we define audience, how we become very afraid of standing up for news values because we're afraid of being accused of being advocacy-oriented. It's been very disturbing to me. And in many ways, I've also worked with, excuse me, I've got gum in my mouth because I have a dry throat and I don't have a lozenge, so it might sound like I'm lisping. And I've also done some very deep work with working with inclusion stories and the problems of Black diversity and voices in the media, and trying to create programs that would deal with the problems both structurally and content-wise. And when I came into journalism in the early 70s, it was kind of an unspoken creed that we all understood what journalism was about in terms of what the values were. And many of us from very different, avenues of life were seeing that the stories that come out of our communities weren't being represented, or the political realities that we understood weren't being represented in what we now call legacy media. And so that time, alternative media was telling all these stories that I couldn't find anywhere else. And that's what drew me to that. I felt like the real values of journalism were actually being practiced in the alternative media. Now, of course, alternative media has become very corporatized, bottom line driven over the decades. And today, what we now call citizen journalists are really today's version of what we were back then. We were all, we all came out of, I just walked into the Bay Guardian one day because I liked what I saw and I decided I wanted to work for them. I didn't have any journalism background. But I had the fire and the passion to ask the questions that should have been asked, and that's what they were looking for. Now, over the years, I hear all this talk about citizen journalism and professional journalists sneering at citizen journalists because they don't know the values and they don't know this and that. And the important fact, as Diane has pointed out, they actually know more about what's going on in terms of how news should be produced than many professional journalists have. And I've witnessed that in the newsroom. And in the newsroom, I can tell you that it's not so much that, at least the journalists of the older generation are lacking principles, it's that the editors are the gatekeepers. And they are so holed up in their newsrooms and rarely go out into their communities, into their audience market, to really connect with what's going on. And so oftentimes the journalists will come back with stories that they aren't able to get through to those gatekeepers. And especially if they had to do with stories around affirmative action and people of color and marginal communities and things like that. So it's been an ongoing struggle. And I've watched the news literacy community, I've watched what's now defined as the news literacy community struggle with all this and trying to figure out how you work with newsroom editors to make it safe enough to actually deal with these very challenging issues. And it's been a struggle. And the darker your skin color is, and the darker the skin color of the people in your stories are, it's really even more of a problem. So what do I get out of all this? Well, I started through when I was working for the Independent Press Association. This was in the midst of seeing massive layoffs begin in the newsrooms, and the first people to go were people of color. And so we started a program at the Independent Press Association called the George Washington Williams Fellowship, and it was designed to capture professional journalists of color leaving mainstream news and who were frustrated with not being able to tell the social justice stories and all the other stories that they had, and was the reason why they became journalists in the first place. And it was designed to capture them and bring them into the independent media and bring those professional journalism sensibilities melded with that community background and bring it into the independent media. And of course, independent media was going through its own definitions, which went through mostly from alternative to progressive and into a mix of independent and progressive, and now we're like struggling with what progressive means because there's a million definitions of progressive, and especially for those of us who worked in the professional journalism world versus those who actually work for specifically point of view, mission-driven outlets. And you bring a group of journalists of color into a situation like this and they don't know how to navigate because they just want to be able to tell their stories, but they also want to be legitimate and credible. They fought very hard. We fought very hard for this legitimacy. And to go back into a world where they think they might lose that credibility is a big problem. And that was one of the biggest struggles I had to deal with in these programs. I'm trying to draw people into our sector of media. So while we might, in our content and our sensibilities, bring a completely accurate and right-on perception of the structural analysis of the social problems and bring that to the story, to our content, we haven't been able to figure out how to transcend our own notions about what we think of ourselves as independent and progressive media in order to be able to bring in the mainstream, the journalists of color as a very, very good example, but also reaching out into a wider audience that today does not have the automatic sensibilities that we had in the 70s. This is a younger generation. They have no historical or institutional memory of what First Amendment issues are, what the role of the press is, and all they get is what they see on Fox News and the noise on the networks primarily. Many don't even read the newspapers anymore, so they turn to their own sources, mostly online. So I think that this sector has the biggest strength we have is the fact that we have no fear of countering the dominant narratives and challenging the powers that be. And that is our job. And that's any journalist's job. But I think that we really need to understand more what the media landscape is now in order to understand how we're going to have more impact with our content. And it really does mean going beyond political definitions of of how we describe our sector. It just undermines the content that we produce if we get stuck in that. And it's still, many of us have come forward and changed and moved out of that realm over the last few years, but I think we still haven't had the really difficult discussions about what that means. And it also keeps out many other journalists who've lost their jobs, not just journalists of color, but other journalists who got into the business for the same reason and are equally disillusioned, don't know what to do with the independent sector. They don't know how to approach it. So in terms of our needs, in terms of community literacy for our newsrooms, I think these are the questions we need to address. I don't think we need to address questions around literacy and content. I think we get that. I think what we need to figure out is how to make our content more accessible to beyond the pew. And we have, our membership ranges from the very, very ideological to those of us who come out of professional journalism and really have the interest of pursuing truth, and we find that in this sector we're able to do that more, but we get caught up in all these ideological definitions of who we are, and it sort of constrains the work that we do. So I approach this whole notion of news literacy kind of from hybrid point of view of having worked both in many different sectors and also coming from, you know, a sector of the audience that is mostly excluded in most media. And it's been a hard road to hard road to hoe. And I think, Jennifer, probably you have your own personal stories that you may or may not be able to tell because you're a program officer.
Oh, come on, we'll get to that.
Of course, but if we're to broaden the impact of the media, of the independent media, we do really have to think hard about who we consider our audience. And I think we're in a position to really kind of bring a cutting edge definition to that, to who we think our audience is and how we reach out to them and how we develop strategies to engage them. Because we're also not afraid of the word advocacy, we're not afraid of the word organizing. I hope we're not. I mean, for the most part, we're not. Let me tell you a story, an anecdote. I was at a meeting many years ago at the University of Southern California, and it was the Ford Foundation, which is one of my big funders, had just funded an institute for justice journalism at USC. And they brought together all the folks that they knew in journalism that were involved in social justice journalism. And then they brought into civil rights advocates and various community advocates on various issues. And the advocates were brought in to talk about the issues that needed to be covered. And I was sitting, on the journalism side, there were like a whole cross-section of different generations of journalists. And when it got down to trying to get the journalists to talk about how they might work with the advocates to get these stories going, the younger journalists, and it didn't matter what color they were, the younger journalists were completely phobic of working with the advocates because this was in the middle of the media noise around media becoming too liberal and too advocacy driven. And these young journalists did not want to be identified with anything that smacked of advocacy. And those of us who came of age in the 70s that were sitting in the room, you could have picked our jaws up off the floor. We turned to each other and we couldn't believe what we saw. And the funders in the room and the other policy people in the room didn't know what to do with this, and nobody has resolved this question since. I think that we are in that position in this sector to deal with this question and to bring forth or promote the values that we believe in. I mean, you know, there's this notion that because we work in the independent media, we're not proper journalists. And I think that we're in a position to define this to our advantage and to have our content go out and influence more people in some very significant ways. And this is conversation, this is the uncomfortable conversation that we need to have.
Okay, great. Well, let's open it up to questions if there are any. If not, I've got some, but yeah.
Oh, I've got a few comments.
Okay, we can have those too.
I'm somebody that's worked for the Bay Guardian, the Berkeley Bar, I worked for the Wall Street Journal, I worked for PBS, New York Times, and I'm a journalism professor now. A few just things fast reactions. There's a crisis on the demand side. Dan Gilmore was a colleague of mine. We know that the consumers are also turning away from journalism in droves. This is a serious problem. Most paid journalists do work of poor quality. That's axiomatic. Most paid journalists are paid to lie. That's axiomatic. That's a starting point. The elite gatekeeper model for journalism, I'm going to talk later about it. It's important that it survives, but it's got to co-evolve with citizen journalism. It's an unstoppable force, citizen journalism. Elite journalists are not social workers. It's very hard to turn them into that. You can train and train and train them, but it's a smaller and smaller group. And now you need to be a rich kid to get into journalism. I know all the young people going into it. They better have wealthy families. They can't go into it otherwise. I don't like the term professional journalist. I think it's an oxymoron. I don't think they're professionals. There's no profession here. There are paid journalists, there are working journalists. The line between citizen, volunteer journalists and paid journalists is arbitrary. And I think you're making a bigger deal of it than you might. All journalists advocate, they all have points of view. We know this for sure, and explicitly or implicitly. So citizen journalists and paid journalists share a lot of structural strengths and weaknesses, but they also have different missions. So I think it's wonderful that you're using news literacy as a pipe to address this.
Well, you know, as both Linda and Jennifer, I think, correctly said, news literacy is it's a young movement. it's growing, but now is the time to be able to really come in and, point it in the right direction. And I think that, all I would say is that I think that the values of journalism, in fact, are the values of democracy. They are the same, okay? It's like we need good, reliable, verified information because we need to be informed citizens. If we're not informed citizens, ultimately, we can't have a functioning democracy. What are those values? They're everyday things that the community already believes in, but they may not know what they are, explicitly.
These are nice thoughts, but
It's
largely,
independence,
I would
it's
disagree with that.
accountability, it's transparency. It's all these things that we as journalists, whether you want to call us professional or paid, I don't care, about the nomenclature, but this is what attracts people. This is what attracted Linda. You just heard her say it. This is why Diane and Joseph are doing the work that they do. But one thing I want to maybe move the conversation to a little bit is that, as I said before, this is also of great value to the journalists and to the media organizations in this age of tumult and the age of, questions about the very sustainability. We have something of value that we can share with the community. And if we share something of value with the community will share things of value back with us, to put it in the most blunt ways. Anyway, yes, Mike.
So, I guess my question is, what counts as citizen journalism? And, especially when it comes to social media, is a really long Facebook post citizen journalism?
Yes.
Or what about a series of tweets? That kind of thing. And then, if so, should people be getting paid for those things?
Well, those are two separate questions. Let me just quickly answer and then throw it to the panel, is that potentially it's all journalism, but it's a series of tweets is only journalism if it's done according to the values of journalism. So if I do a series of tweets where I just retweet information that I haven't even bothered to verify and half of it is wrong, no, that's not journalism. But if I've actually gone out and done the verification work and I know that this is solid information and I'm sharing with my friends and followers, then it is. That would be my answer. Anybody else want to weigh in on citizen?
I mentioned a couple days ago that I have done a bit of work on sort of trying to define acts of journalism. So what do we actually mean by that? What do the courts mean by that? What do professional organizations mean by that? What do we all think of that? And one of the things I like to point out is, when Brian Stelter of the New York Times went down to Joplin, Missouri after the tornadoes there, he spent about 3 days tweeting almost, once or twice every 15 minutes. And then he got home at night at his computer and wrote up the story for the New York Times. And both of those things were reporting. And similarly, a citizen journalist named John Neffel, who has actually been working a lot more for other publications now, but at the time when I knew him, was just going out to Occupy protests and tweeting, and then once a week he did a radio podcast. And so his tweeting was his journalism, and he was arrested twice while doing that. And so in those two cases, the tweeting, yes, is journalism. And in addition, there's a guy, Justin Osiello, who's an urban planner in New Jersey, who started a Facebook page to cover weather-related issues in New Jersey. And his page now has more followers than ProPublica and WNYC combined. And he has been reporting on the recovery from Hurricane Sandy on Facebook only. He has no other platform. So these long posts on Facebook, and he crowdsources things with the crowd, and he verifies everything. He does it, and it's got to the point now where he actually wants to leave urban planning and do this full time. But obviously, Facebook gets the ad money, not him. So he's trying to figure out how to make that transition. But so yes, these are all tools, and the question is how the tools are used, I think.
One other quick example, but probably a lot of people are familiar with what Andy Carvin did on Twitter, where he basically, he worked at NPR, but he didn't work at NPR as a journalist. He was a social media strategist, and he started covering the Arab Spring in the very early days. Why? Because he had gone to a blogging conference in Tunisia years earlier, and he knew a lot of bloggers in that space. And he basically created an entirely new form of journalism happening only on Twitter. He's now left NPR, and he's just been hired by Omidyar's, new digital operation, First Look Media. So all of these things, can be acts of journalism, but they only are if they're actually inculcating the values of journalism in a news literate way.
So the one thing I would add about Andy is just that what he did also with a lot of transparency. So I learned a lot about how you verify sources when you're sitting in Washington DC trying to report on something happening in Egypt by watching what Andy did, because he was publicly showing his work, saying, is this verified? Can you confirm this? I have doubts about this. And so that is another form of news literacy where we're modeling for our communities how to do this, which I think is important. But also to your point, Maya, about being paid. I think there is large questions about, as we continue to think about how we use user-generated content and how we're collaborating with our communities. Crowdsourcing is great, but how do we compensate or how are we inclusive so that we can have the widest variety of people involved in that? That's an important question.
Well, personally, I think that's where the McCormick Foundation comes in.
Well, actually, I just wanted to add, and prior to the McCormick Foundation, I worked in the public radio sphere, and I can just, so from an institutional perspective, I wanted to kind of show citizen journalism as folks that, so the public radio station I worked for, I'll just say it easy, we're the third largest market. Chicago is particularly sprawling and diverse. And there was this issue of, okay, our audiences are about to not be alive on this earth anymore. And Chicago is very diverse, and it was increasingly diverse, since, the 90s. But then when you looked at the audience for WBZ, it was primarily, a dwindling audience. So how do you become more relevant, et cetera, et cetera? So, this big experiment was a second station that was only going to basically open the doors to what was called user-generated content. So basically, you call a hotline, anybody from the community. So as far as citizen journalism is concerned, I think it was anybody who didn't work for the station. So you call in this hotline, and basically all the stuff that was recorded on this hotline just was thrown on the air, not curated. So basically, it sounded like crap, and nobody liked it. And it really did. I think it really hurt the branding of citizen journalism, because when you don't curate it, which quite frankly, our paid journalists could have done very effectively by structuring kind of a story and saying, okay, let's, et cetera. So basically, a lot of folks in Chicago that, were the affluent, whatever, et cetera, they basically said, oh, citizen journalism is crap. Why would you listen to the community, et cetera? And quite frankly, our board members, who are also comprised of the target, public radio demographic, use that failed experiment as kind of, a soapbox to say, yeah, don't listen to communities. But unfortunately, what happened was audience continued to go down, and it continues, because if you're not engaging the communities, the market that you're actually in, then what is that going to mean for your listeners in the future? So I looked very far and wide for a model where a station, and by the way, it's an over $20 million operating budget. Our community engagement partnership budget was, $100,000 of that. And it was one person who was a partnership person, and the partnership program, the community partnership program, is a program where, if you're an outside organization, you apply once a year. You have an opportunity to apply once a year. This is a public radio station, to be a part of the partnership program, and you can only apply once a year. So once you apply, basically the community partnership, is that we go out and we record your events, and then we broadcast it, maybe online, have it online. That was what community partnerships was. So, the program, I mean. So I looked far and wide. I couldn't really find a model in the States where I thought, okay, and I say mainstream media because this is a large station in this market. And I couldn't find anything that was successful until I actually ran into a Toronto public radio station. And what this general manager did was basically she brought in all of her managing editors, all the lead hosts and producers, and she's like, look, I want this place to sound and look like Toronto. So how do we do that? And basically they, and it was controversial because she couldn't do all of it, but basically all of her lead producers and editors came into a room and said, all right, we're Muslim, we're Chinese, we're South Asian, we're Afro-Caribbean, and we're Latino. It was just, so we're like, all right. So she said, all right, we're gonna just start with these 5 communities, and then we're going to put out, it's like kind of a Craigslist ad, where to the community and say, all right, we're gonna give you an opportunity to pitch a 5-minute segment on one of our, morning drive time show. And basically, all these people came in from the community, but the journalists and the producer, the paid journalists, the folks that worked for the station, came in, interviewed, and said, look, you represent this really interesting piece of the community that sounds like Toronto, et cetera, et cetera. And in 18 months, basically, that radio station, it was the first time in Canadian history, I think, where that Toronto radio station, the morning drive time program, was the first, #1 in that market. So she proved that really, figuring out a structured relationship by bringing community folks in and having your paid staffers curate that and structure that relationship is that business case. She was #1 in 18 months, and they've been #1 since, 56 times since. So I hope that kind of answers. It just depends, and obviously you have these one-off, really amazing examples of folks that are showing that traction when they have that relationship. But I just thought it was a compelling example that I hope that we can replicate more and more.
#1, we like, Tom.
Sort of an under theme of all of it is the legitimacy of the whatever organization it is, and the legitimacy of the even if you've got professional, you've got paid, you've got people who have the rules and know how to do it and are good at it, all those things. Still, what happens is that we're up against a huge monolith, corporate monolith that really doesn't have the same interests in us.
But I think what you're trying to say here is that the entry point for change is by dealing with the audience, right? Yeah. So, and I think that we need to think more about how you're going to engage the audience and to respond to the fact that the audience isn't making the demands that it should
Absolutely.
on the news producers to get what they want. And that's really the outcome of a program like this. It's only scratching the surface when you're talking about teaching journalism values to the consumers. Really, we need to start looking at the biases that consumers also bring to the news.
Absolutely.
And how that influences the news that's produced, and how the audiences that want that to change can make their demands. So we're moving from a supply side definition of news to a demand side. That's really what we're trying to do here, right?
And that's the elephant in the room, because citizen journalism to the right wing, we know what that is. And the right wing has its own version of citizen.
They've certainly lobbied their audiences very well. They get how to mobilize their. But the media sector outside of that, from the mainstream to the left, don't like to deal with the question. Well, actually, I changed that. If you're working with network TV, or if you're working in magazine, you deal with audience questions. But it's a commercially based strategy. If you're dealing in general news, you don't even think about your audience. That's one of the biggest problems with reporters, is they don't think about who they're writing to. And that's why so much of it is so bad. It's so badly written. I can't even read it, most of the time. When you're talking about, where I lost my thought.
Well, there's one thing
If I
to
can
do about that,
interject
which is
about that.
to do it by example. And it builds.
Yeah, I mean, for us, being called People Power Media, it was a big decision, obviously, because there's some people that don't want to talk to us, for example, small business owners about minimum wage issues, when we're going to say, we know that they have problems with it, and we want to air that voice. But they're like, no, you're going to represent us in a bad way. But we decided, this is what we want to do, and we're going to own it. And whether people talk, think of, like you were saying, we're going to be okay with the fact that some people are going to label us as media activism, even though we don't think we are, because we're trying to have journalistic values. And another thing I wanted to throw out as a point to consider is, again, on your Twitter point, if Twitter is, talking about personalities, and then we're not being scared to be advocates or to share opinions, and increasingly that's more popular, what does that mean for questions about legitimacy? And I think that's a huge question that we have to raise, as far as, if we're going to become more popular, does that mean that we have to share more opinions, and does that hurt our credibility?
So,
Well,
we're running out of time.
Yeah, we're running out of time, so I think we didn't open just a can of worms, but Pandora's box. And let this to be only the beginning of discussion. I want to thank the panel, really great points.